Next, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Janani Shanmuganathan, and I am counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and my questions are for Ms. Telford. So we know that there were 3 IRG meetings that took place on February the 10th, the 12th, and the 13th. And while cabinet ministers were present at these meetings, it's not a meeting of the entire cabinet, right?
Correct.
And we do know that there was a meeting with the entire cabinet that took place the evening of February the 13th, right?
That's right.
And the following morning on February the 14th, there was a meeting with the first ministers. And then later that day on February the 14th, or at some point that day, there was a decision made to declare the public order emergency.
Later that day, that's right.
Thank you. And so I just have a few questions about cabinet meetings. Does the Prime Minister's office advise the Prime Minister on the agendas for cabinet meetings?
Usually the Privy Council office, led by the clerk, puts forward an agenda for a cabinet meeting. And actually, usually John's team here will go back and forth with them a bit on it in case there's any insight into, particularly into time management of the meeting. But they will present that to the Prime Minister.
Okay, so it's fair to say, though, that you have some input. The Prime Minister's office has some input into the agenda.
Input would be fair, yes.
All right. And who ultimately decides the agenda at cabinet meetings? Like, who has the final say?
The Prime Minister.
And does the Prime Minister's office advise the Prime Minister on which non-cabinet officials attend cabinet meetings?
No, not really. I mean, the clerk of the Privy Council would be the person who would advise and advise on officials in terms of who should attend, and then there's usually a few from the Prime Minister's office who attend, and the Prime Minister agrees with who those are.
Okay, so does the Prime Minister's office offer any input in terms of suggestions of who could or who should attend these meetings that are non-cabinet members?
Only of our own team.
Okay. And who ultimately decides which non-cabinet officials attend these cabinet meetings?
I think I just said that, but I'll try again. So the clerk in terms of officials on the public service side. And ultimately, it's the Prime Minister who decides who he welcomes in the cabinet room. But the clerk will advise and sign off on a list from an official's perspective. And then there's usually some representatives from the Prime Minister's office.
Okay, but the Prime Minister, I take it, has the final say of who attends.
Of course.
All right. And does the Prime Minister's office advise the Prime Minister on what information should be shared at these cabinet meetings?
Again, the Privy Council office, and so it's the clerk who will, and her teams, who will put together the information. And we may have some supplemental or additional information from a political perspective that we may provide in a briefing ahead of cabinet. But the documents come from the public service side.
Okay, so leaving aside the physical documents that are coming in, it's fair to say, though, that the Prime Minister's office has some input into the kinds of documents that are provided at the cabinet meetings.
Yes, I mean, we will provide feedback. Sometimes they'll ask us from the public service side what our thoughts are around, especially as it relates to meeting flow and what might be most useful, that kind of thing for the ministers.
Okay, and I take it it's fair to say that it's, again, the Prime Minister who's got the ultimate say of the information that's provided at these cabinet meetings?
Yes.
And in terms of documents at the cabinet meetings, I take it you also have the Prime Minister's office also provides some input into the kinds of documents. I think we've already touched on this, the documents as well.
Yes.
Okay. And so in terms of the February 13th meeting, the evening meeting with the full cabinet, who sort of set the agenda for the cabinet meeting?
Same process as I just described.
Okay, and did the Prime Minister's office offer any input for the agenda for that February 13th evening cabinet meeting?
So things were moving very quickly that day, and we were on the brief ahead of the cabinet meeting. And so I imagine we probably added some thoughts in terms of how the meeting might flow, but that would have been the extent of it that day.
Okay, and what about the information that was provided at that February 13th evening cabinet meeting? Did the Prime Minister's office offer any input on the information that would be provided?
I'm not even sure if we would have at that time.
I don't recall doing that, no.
Okay, what about the documents at that February 13th evening meeting? Did the Prime Minister's office offer any input?
Sorry, I'm not sure I know the difference between the last one and this one. I thought we were just answering about documents. So same answer.
So information, it could be things that are said vocally out loud to the cabinet members versus physical documents that are provided to the cabinet members.
So as I said a couple of times in the briefing ahead of cabinet, we will provide our insight, our advice, our best advice and feedback in terms of how the flow might work and just ways of approaching different things. But that's really the extent of our involvement in preparation for the meeting, whether it be documents or information.
And again, I guess it's fair to say for that February 13th evening meeting, it's the Prime Minister who had the ultimate say over the agenda, the information that was provided, and the documents that were shared. Is that fair?
Yes.
And just my last few questions I have. We've heard about this assessment from CSIS, an assessment that ultimately concluded that the situation did not amount to threats to the security of Canada as set out in the CSIS Act. Was this a threat assessment provided to the cabinet members at the February 13th evening meeting with the full cabinet?
I am not sure whether it was part of the documents.
I think the deputy clerk and clerk, I think their testimony was
On this?
on this. They led that process, so I would refer to their testimony. I don't recall anything more than that.
But none of you know? Okay, what about an alternative threat assessment? A threat assessment that's different from the CSIS threat assessment. Was any such assessment provided to the cabinet members at that evening February 13th meeting with the entire cabinet?
So all of these assessments were provided to the incident response, the IRG, earlier that day, and then that was really rolled up and reported out to cabinet in the evening.
Okay, but the members of the IRG meeting, it's not the entire cabinet, right?
Correct.
And so I'm just asking about was there a document with a threat assessment that's different from the CSIS threat assessment? Was there a document that was shared at that February 13th evening meeting?
I can't speak to that.
And can either of the other
No,
two
I'd
of you?
refer back to the deputy clerk's testimony.
Okay. And we've heard about this legal opinion that was created that talked about how the definition of threats to the security of Canada in the CSIS Act has a different interpretation when applied to the Emergencies Act. I'm not asking about the content of that opinion. I just want to know, do you know if that legal opinion had been provided at that February 13th evening meeting with the entire cabinet?
Yeah. I'm not sure what we can say.
Yeah, I'm not sure what we can say on that. I think there's some cabinet confidence issues there.
So I don't see anyone objecting, and I think someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but the input that's provided to cabinet in terms of what information was provided is not covered by cabinet privilege. I'm not asking about what was discussed or the deliberations.
Right.
I just want to know if that legal opinion had been provided at that February 13th evening meeting with the entire cabinet.
And Commissioner, it's Brian Gover on behalf of the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada maintains the objection that you heard yesterday from government counsel then about solicitor-client privilege pertaining to the information provided by Attorney General, Minister of Justice Lametti.
Okay, so I think we're stuck on that.
And just so I'm clear, that objection means I can't ask whether that opinion had been provided during that meeting? Sorry, I can't see anyone.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for an answer on that
It's
position.
Brian Gover, you may not, consistent with maintaining the objection, inquire into the content of any advice given by the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
And the question is, does that include the fact of, or of the opinion or not?
My friend may inquire as to whether an opinion was expressed. The fact of the opinion, not the content.
So to be clear, I was never asking about the content of the opinion. Was the fact of this, was this legal opinion, the fact that this legal opinion existed and whatever its content may have been, shared at that February 13th evening meeting with the full cabinet?
I'm not sure from a document perspective, there were certainly discussions around it.
Okay, and the final question I have is, there was this Ottawa Police Service POU plan. Was that plan shared to the cabinet members at that February 13th evening meeting with the entire cabinet?
We had heard at various points in the lead up to the invocation that there were plans or action was about to be taken in various situations, including Ottawa. Absolutely, that was part of the discussion and consideration, the fact that action had not been taken up until that point. And the assessment was that was because law enforcement did not have the tools they needed.
Okay, but was that plan, the document, the plan, there's a document that's called the OPSPOU. Was that document shared with
It's
February 13th cabinet members?
It's hard to comment because we don't have the document. I don't know.
I'm
what
not
you're
sure what
referring to.
document that is.
Sure. I'm not sure how much time I have left, Commissioner Rouleau. I can just bring up the document just to ask them if this was something that was shared during that meeting.
You're over time, so if you want to put up the document, that'll be
Yeah,
it.
that's fine.
And just,
so
I'm not
it's-
sure they understand what it is. A POU plan is a public order unit, which are the police officers who go in on a police public order process. Or
So I can't speak to that specific, but Cabinet was definitely aware that on February 13th, when they were discussing, the situation in Ottawa was worse than it had been at any point. And the threats of violence, the actual violence was terrifying. That's what was discussed at Cabinet.
Okay, but you can't say whether that document had been shared during that meeting.
We still haven't.
And I just want to be fair to the witness. Sorry.
Sorry.
It's
Don't know what document.
PBNSC CAN 407734. That's the document. And I'll just ask them if this is something they've recognized and whether they know if it was shared. Just on that page. So I take it from shaking your heads, no, we need an audible
That's not
answer.
familiar to
I've
me.
never seen this, no.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are all my questions.
okay, next is the City of Ottawa, please.